Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Wildcast podcast brought to you by the Arizona Daily Star, Tucson.com, and the Wildcaster. I'm Brett Ferris, sports editor, along with Michael Lev, our senior writer and columnist. And we have a special guest today as part of our Big 12 Blitz package, which is our efforts to introduce you, the Arizona fan, to the Big 12 sometimes new and sometimes existing, but the new Big 12 schools, cities, communities, fan bases, traditions, everything related to Arizona and the Wildcats joining the Big 12 and beyond football. Football is a big part of it, but it's more than football. We're excited today to have Matt Murschel with the Orlando Sentinel join us to talk a little bit about UCF. And I'll be honest, Matt, to start this off, UCF is probably the least known of the schools as a whole from my perspective, just because, as we were talking before we started recording, it's a relatively young institution. It's not young in the sense it's 10 years, 20 years old, but it's young in the parlance of playing at big time college sports levels. And that might actually be a benefit to it as this massive change is going on in college sports, right? Where it's a little more pliable and can react more than one of these institutions that's been doing things the same way for 150 years.
Oh, very much so. I mean, you think about, it's only been it was maybe a little less than a decade ago that UCF, was a little more than a decade actually, when UCF was actually in a, group of five conference. When you look at them going from the Mid-American Conference to Conference USA and then transitioning into the American, then going from the American to the Big 12 last year. I mean, it's been it seems like a quick transition. It's taken a bit, but they've managed to get here as well. And like you said, they've been that pliability, being able to, adjust on the fly. That's really helped them out a lot, especially over the last year and a half as they've made the transition into the Big 12, because, they've had to adjust some things. They had to look at their athletic department, adding more staffing at times. They had to look at their budget. They had to increase their budget. They had to look at how they were doing fundraising. That kind of had to be changed a little bit going into the Big 12. You look at NIL component with the collective. The collective really had to ramp itself up a lot more than it had in the past because of the fact that they were making this move. So they've been able to do that relatively seamlessly. I'm sure Terry Mahajan, the athletic director, will say it wasn't that seamlessly from the inside, but relatively to what maybe an established institution had to do when they came in, maybe from another power conference like the Pac-12 or wherever.
Yeah, to that end, Matt, all four of the newcomers last year did struggle in conference play. I believe the combined record was 8-28 for Houston, UCF, Cincinnati, and BYU. Why do you think it was so hard for the Knights and for the others this first year, and why might things be different in year two?
Well, I think initially, it had to do a lot with depth. Talking with the coaching staff and some of the players that played last year, they said, I think they just didn't anticipate how much depth they would need going into a power conference. When you're a group of five, your best players, you may have a handful of great players, and they can kind of overcome some of these depth issues at times. But you get to a power conference, it's different. You're not able to do that. So I think depth was a big factor. They had to find a way to build more depth. I think also conditioning was something that UCF, I know, in the offseason worked really hard on. They brought in a new strength and conditioning coach. His program basically was help them out to finish games. UCF was in the majority of a lot of their games last year, but just whether they were, whether it was tied or they were leading going into the second half of the game, they weren't able to finish. They usually faltered in the fourth quarter. So they wanted to look at that strength and conditioning. And then I just think, again, it's a different recruiting base. When you're recruiting in a G5 league, you're maybe excited to get 2 and 3 stars in some regard, or high 3 stars, maybe occasional 4-star. But when you move to a power conference, you've got to get those 4 stars. You got to get 5s and 4s. You've got to get some of those guys as well to kind of help you out. So I think that was the biggest transition factor is that building up that strength, building up their stamina, and also providing enough depth to be able to last in some of those games.
Gus Malzahn and his staff have done a pretty good job on the recruiting trail over the last couple of years, haven't they? They have landed a lot of 4 stars. Do you give most of the credit to him? Is it NIL efforts? Why do you think UCF's been able to have more success in that area?
I think it's probably both. I mean, Gus has done a good job. When he got here, in 2021, one of the things he said was, listen, we're going to recruit like our hair is on fire. And we're going to recruit not only the state of Florida really well, but we're going to recruit Orlando. We're going to put basically a dome over Orlando, and we're going to try to keep all that local talent that this year, and we're going to take advantage of that. And that's something that he's done really well. And I think one of the things that's helped that is the transition to the Big 12. It's easier to go into a young man's home and say, listen, you're going to be playing on Fox, on a Friday night, Black Friday against Utah, and that's a lot more attractive in some ways than it is maybe to say, okay, you're going to be playing Tulane or a Memphis or something like that. I think that's been a big push. I think NIL, obviously, as I mentioned, has worked really hard to kind of, build up its resources, its funding. That's helped a little bit too as well. And then I think, Gus's familiarity with the SEC, he brought in a lot of his former coaches that were in big power conferences. They understand exactly what it takes to recruit, to play in those leagues. So they've also gone out and tried to do that as well. And I think it has paid off. I think you've mentioned, there are some 4-stars. They're their best class they had in the program history was last year. I think they were ranked in the top 40. They've got a strong class again this year. And they're really, the pitch has been, come here and play for us and get an opportunity to be a hometown hero if you're from the area. And that's really kind of helped them out rather than seeing these guys take off and head to, the Alabamas or the Michigans or their Ohio States. He's saying, come stay at home and you can play in front of your family.
I mean, it's interesting.
Go ahead, Brett.
Michael. Well, I was gonna say, it's interesting. You said, these guys leaving for the Alabamas, the Michigans, the Ohio States. And, 20 years ago, we would have said these guys leaving for the Miamis, the Florida States, the Floridas. But where does UCF, I know obviously this is an unfair ask, but where does UCF in terms of growth and culture and becoming a prominent program sit amongst those big four? And I guess you could count, USF to some degree, maybe a little less so, but where does UCF sort of fit amongst the old guard of big time Florida college football and college sports as a whole?
I think if you ask someone at UCF, they'll tell you they're right there at the top. You know what I mean? I think you look at how Florida football as a state, for the colleges has been over the last couple of years. And it hasn't been anywhere near like it's been, decades ago. You used to have Florida and Florida State and Miami, and they were playing for national championships or they were playing for SEC titles or ACC titles. And that just hasn't been the case for a while there. Florida's program has been down, obviously, over the last couple of years. Billy Napier has had his struggles. He's in a hot seat going into this year. Miami, even with Mario Cristobal coming back, as much as there's been excitement, Miami hasn't been a competitive team, so to speak, when it comes to the national landscape. Florida State just recently last year has bounced back and do that as well. So UCF is saying, okay, we've been there. Look, we won in 2018. We went undefeated. We won, a national championship. And in 2019, we went to the Fiesta Bowl. They feel like they've put themselves in a good spot and should be in that top, 2 or 3 conversation. Especially with the recruiting class.
The parallel is Michael and I have had many conversations about this because of the Pac-12 history over the last decade. Mm-hmm. And part of this series, we talked about them just yesterday, but the parallel is kind of Utah a little bit. You mentioned the undefeated season in 2018, going from, mid-major success to power conference, and what can they do? Another, big time bowl game, the Fiesta Bowl. I mean, it's actually interesting to see that parallel. And I recognize that, it hasn't sustained itself exactly every single year, but the blueprint is there for that.
Yeah, very much so. And I think part of that blueprint was, like I said, it's not, you can credit Gus for some of this, but the blueprint went back until 2016 when Danny White was the athletic director, and he brought in Scott Frost, a guy who was unproven, from Oregon. And Scott Frost came in and look what they did in 2 short years. They go undefeated and they beat Gus, ironically in the Peach Bowl. And, you saw that. Then that transitioned over to Josh Heupel taking over. And Josh was able to continue that same sort of thing. And then bringing in Gus. I mean, so they've done a great job in hiring. I think the athletic department has done a great job in the sense that when Danny White left to go to Tennessee, they brought in Terry Mahajer, a guy who was really kind of, a lot of high energy guy, high octane guy who's really, was willing to do whatever it takes. When you talk about being out in the public's eye, trying to push the program as much as he could, keep pushing forward. And then along those same lines, the fundraising really took off and they started selling more tickets, season tickets, and the fundraising really started to pay off. And they started getting big donations and they started getting some projects done. And so this all has kind of happened over the last decade. And you've seen that kind of pay off. Like you said, very much like Utah, the blueprint is there. And I think they just continue to build off that.
I was just looking at the UCF football schedule for this year. Very disappointed to not see Houston on there, and I will explain why. One of the little-known rivalries that exists here in our country, right, is between Orlando and Houston, which is truly Space City, right? Mm-hmm. And I think they should play each other every year in football for that reason. Obviously, they're not, but UCF, I think, started out as a sort of a school where aspiring astronauts would come to attend to kind of launch their careers, no pun intended. They have a space game every single year. Arizona happens to be the team that is playing in the space game this season. Matt, what can you tell us about what the space game is all about and why that is potentially a trap game for anyone who participates in it?
Yeah, it's a fun thing that UCF has done over the last 4 or 5 years, and it's a really great tribute to kind of the space program itself. Obviously here in Florida, you've got so much ties to the space and the rockets going off and everything like that. So they take a lot of pride in that, and they have a lot of engineers and they have a lot of people who've been part of NASA and even some of the private organizations who've come from UCF. So they've created these space uniforms, and then each year the uniform has been different, and the helmet's been different. They've had different little embellishments that kind of showcase whether it's the constellations, whether it's some other aspect of space program, and it's just kind of built over the last 4 or 5 years. And I think if I'm not mistaken, they are undefeated in the space game because this is one of those things where the fans really get into it. And I'm with you. I really would love to have seen Houston and UCF continue this tradition. I was disappointed last year. I think I might have wrote this, is that when Houston was the last game of the season and UCF needed to beat them to be bowl eligible, I said they should have brought back the space uniforms for that game, even though they already used them. And then Houston should have had their own space uniforms. It would have been a fun thing.
100%. Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. And they never did it. And Houston just kind of downplayed it all week long and never wanted to talk about it. But it is something that is a big factor. And the fans love it. The uniforms are great. In fact, when the EA Sports game was coming out this year, I got a chance to preview it like a little earlier. And I remember the first question everyone kept asking me is, are the space uniforms there? Are the space uniforms there? So, people love it. I mean, don't get me wrong. They love the uniforms to begin with. Yeah, no, they were. Yes, they did have awesome. One of the, but and it's one of the more popular ones to buy. So fans love it. The players love it. Gus has done promos where he's been in a spacesuit before. That's just, and that's how much they embrace this thing. So yes, it is a big time event, and fans if you go on campus for that game, and you guys will see this, you'll see fans dressed up in astronaut uniforms, and everyone takes the space thing very seriously. And I think it just kind of adds a little extra element to the game itself.
I will say our audience who's listening is probably sitting there saying, well, Arizona has a big NASA and space tie too, which is actually kind of a cool part about it. If it's not Houston, the difference is obviously Houston and nearby, Cape Canaveral to Orlando obviously is where these things take off and land. But there is a neat connection, a very, very big astronomy and space science program here at U of A and connected to Tucson as well. So I would be surprised, maybe not uniforms, if U of A does not hype this up too. Even though it's on the road, because I think that we haven't seen it yet, but I would be shocked if they don't for the same reason. So as a consolation, not a constellation, as a consolation, it's nice. It's nice to have Arizona in it if Houston can't be.
Yeah.
Be careful. Be careful what you wish for. Oklahoma State went in. They were ranked either 15th or 17th, depending on what poll you were looking at, and they lost 45-3 in the space game last year. So I don't know. I have that one circled as a loss for Arizona. Speaking of this year's schedule. So
speaking of where the space game is, tell us a little about the stadium and the bounce house. I've seen you post recently. You've done some of these similar conversations with some Big 12 folks you've posted on social media some videos of the press box. Literally just, it's an earthquake. It looks like. Tell us a little bit about that. If fans were to go and experience that, I imagine, I say this not knowing off the top of my head how long you've been covering UCF or at the Orlando Sentinel, but I'm imagining the experience is significantly greater in the last 17 years with its own stadium versus what it was like at Camping World and kind of a more general situation before it was able to move to the new building.
Yeah, it really, really has. I mean, when they built, the bounce house, at the time, it was the first game was against Texas, years ago. And so that was a big draw, obviously. And as the time has gone on, it's gotten more popular. They've sold out games. I mean, it is definitely something that I think it's a unique experience because when the fans start bouncing up and down, and it reminds you a little bit what happens at Camp Randall, in Wisconsin. But when the fans start bouncing up and down, the stadium shakes. And like you mentioned, the video I posted this, it was from a video I took a couple of years ago, and it was in the press box. And you have like a water bottle. You can see the water bottle shaking. because it'll start shaking. There have been opposing media writers who will sit in that press box sometimes and look around when it starts happening because they wonder, is this safe? Is everything going on? But, the fans love it. People,
a lot of engineers at UCF we've discussed.
A lot of engineers.
So there's been some checking.
Yes. And so, it's been one of those things that the fans really enjoy. They love to get into it, especially the student section. It's one of the reasons I think the students really kind of get into it. They love jumping up and down. They love they love the idea of being the bounce house. It gives them a little extra advantage as well. When you put that all together with the light shows that they've added, the music that they've added, it just makes another extra dimension. And I think that's what fans will really kind of get a unique opportunity to check out.
So we know that football has elevated its profile at UCF. What would you say is the school's next best sport?
I would say probably softball. Softball has been up there. They've competed well, getting to the NCAA tournament and having opportunities there. Baseball has brought in a new coach last year, Rich Wallace, who's a former UCF guy, and he was from Orlando, and they had a good run last year in the first year in the Big 12. Basketball has been there. They have had moments, but again, they've had moments where they've also struggled at times. Last year I would put basketball up high because they had even though the record didn't show it, I felt like that was a good year for them because to play the kind of level of competition they were playing in the Big 12 for the first time. To beat 3 ranked teams for the first time in program history. The Kansas win at home was amazing, and the fans stormed the court. And, to get those kind of opportunities, I think they were right there. So those are probably the major, the cheerleading program has won 4 national championships. So, we'll toot the horn there as well when it comes to that. And other sports have done well at times. But I would say softball was probably next, with baseball being right there and basketball as well.
I was surprised. Surprised is probably not fair and makes me seem like an idiot to some extent for not just recognizing this is a big country with a lot of different schools that have histories beyond the last 20 years. But when I was looking for a part of this series includes some, not necessarily Mount Rushmore, but some, notable alumni. Football has quite a few. Dante Culpepper, Asante Samuel, Kevin Smith, the Griffin brothers, Brandon Marshall. Michelle Akers is a big one from a couple of decades ago. Was FIFA's women's soccer player of the century, and she's a UCF alum. She was huge on those U.S. women's national teams that had won the early World Cups in the late 90s and early 2000s. So it's interesting seeing there is a history. It's not brand new. And amongst more than just football. I know I just named a bunch of football players, but kind of neat. I don't have a direct question, but just wanted to point that out, that I was excited to see. All right, I recognize a lot of this, and I had forgotten about Dante Culpepper. I remember it now. Yeah. I at the time I remember it, but yeah.
Dante's had a unique history with UCF. He's obviously one of the record setters, and he did so much for the program, and I don't think anyone will argue that he's not really the godfather of the football program in some ways, for when they played back at the Citrus Bowl and everything like that. But he's really embraced what's going on here. A lot of what's nice about UCF, and I'm sure every school has this, but they have a lot of their past come back. A lot of former players come back and spend a lot of time, whether it's, visiting during games, whether it's just, to say, hey, for fundraising, whatever, they're there. And I think that's something neat to see. You can always have a home game and you'll see 2 or 3 former players there as well, which I think is always something that's kind of neat. Gabe Davis, who's a former wide receiver for UCF, who's now with the Jacksonville Jaguars. He practices in the off season on the UCF practice fields. He goes out there and you can see him out there running around, And I think that's something that's really unique. And I've talked to some players about that, and they really embrace that. They want to see these guys out there because it gets them inspired. Like, oh man, this is a guy who's in the NFL. He's practicing in our practice field. I want to be there just like this guy and hopefully have some success as well.
I'd forgotten about, you mentioned the Jaguars, and I forgot Blake Bortles. There's names all over the place. Yeah. So part of this also includes, again, like I said a little bit ago, if an Arizona fan was to get on a plane and head to Orlando, which, it's one of the first, I'm not sure if West Virginia is a little bit. Yeah, Morgantown's a little bit further technically, but it's one of the furthest spots in the conference from Tucson, but it's not hard to get to. It's Orlando. It's obviously with the the entertainment options, the theme parks, there are flights from Tucson and Phoenix all the time. So I would be shocked if Arizona fans don't see this as a legitimate destination to catch football, basketball, and other games. So if that is the case, and they do, what can they expect around the campus itself? Has it evolved in its own way in the last 30 years or so to become a more vibrant traditional college community? Is it unique in some ways? Where would you recommend people find good food? What would you kind of talk about the UCF campus for our Arizona fans?
Yeah, I think the UCF campus has grown a lot, over the years, I mean, and they've, I think, it's, it used to be considered kind of a commuter college, I mean, they got over 70,000 students there, a lot of live around Central Florida area and then come into the school there. A lot, are actually there. They have their own downtown campus as well. But the campus where, all the football, basketball, and sports take place, it's grown, I mean, it's not a mega campus like you maybe get with some programs, but it definitely has the feel of, like a college town inside a larger community in Orlando. And Orlando as a whole has embraced UCF really well. I mean, they've actually, over the last couple of years, have really kind of taken on the moniker of being UCF being their hometown team. So you'll get a lot of Orlando fans who may not have gone to the school who are very, who are excited about this going on. And because of the ties with the entertainment industry, I mean, you come down here, I've had talked to people about this, especially last year when we had some schools like Baylor come down here. A lot of fans said, listen, we came a little bit early. We went down to Disney. We went down to Universal. We went down to the theme parks. You can get into the theme parks, do all those things. There's tons of places to eat in this community. If you love to eat like I do, you go around to Winter Park area is a little community that's north of the city that you can find some good food. Around the university itself, there's a lot of good little restaurants. They really pride themselves on that as well. Barbecue, Cuban food, anything you're kind of in the mood for, you can find there as well. And there's plenty of entertainment too, as well. We have the arena itself, the basketball arena does sometimes host concerts. You've got Camping World Stadium downtown. They host concerts sometimes. Kia Center, which hosts the NBA team, the Orlando Magic. I mean, they have things. We've got so much than that going on that, sometimes fans come down here and they'll take in a Magic game, maybe the night before going to the football games. So there's lots of things you can kind of do that just isn't, just football or basketball, college basketball. And it's all within relative ease driving distance wise. So, it's not like you have to go an hour to kind of see these things. So you jump on I-4 if you want from the airport, and you can be right there within, 20 or 30 minutes, depending on the time of day.
Yeah, that's cool. I mean, we talk a lot about small towns. Tucson's are kind of oddly in the middle. It's about a 1 million person metro area, but the university is absolutely the centerpiece. Whereas a lot of these places, it really is the college and the university is the town. But to have a place like Orlando on the footprint is I think really neat. I think it's a draw, like you said, for numerous things. Planning a 5-day trip and there's a football game in the middle is kind of neat. Fall breaks, depending when a football game falls, or a basketball game for kids in the winter portion of the school year and stuff. I could see it very much becoming a destination spot for Arizona fans, kind of, it's further geographically, but kind of to the point that Vegas has become a big spot for Arizona fans whenever the football or basketball teams are there for the Pac-12 tournament in the past and so on. It very much became McHale North was the moniker for it. So I think that's a neat part of when you look at the sort of balance points of the Big 12 and the opportunity that Arizona brings to it.
It feels like a unique addition to the Big 12 in the sense that there's one pro team, right, in the four major sports, right? A lot of the towns in the Big 12 are just college towns only, like Manhattan, Kansas, Ames, Iowa, Lawrence, Kansas. You also have Houston, right, which is got, I think, all of everything except hockey. Cincinnati has the Bengals and the Reds. So there's an interesting mix of
I guess, Tempe and ASU technically has 3,
right.
I guess, if you count with the Phoenix area. That's a good point.
Utah,
it is an interesting
Utah now has basketball and hockey. But there's a good balance. Like you can get that like true college town experience in certain places that you go, and you can get the little flavor of a bigger city in some of the other Big 12 destinations.
Yeah, I grew up near the South Bend, South Bend, Indiana. So I grew up near Notre Dame, and that's very much a college, a college town. I mean, the community is built kind of around the campus, and so I had an idea exactly what a college town felt like. And the American wasn't that way so much. So Temple was in Philadelphia. Memphis is obviously Memphis. A lot of big towns, big cities. What I mean, and so Orlando's not that. It's a big city, but it's not to that extent. And I think the nice thing about Orlando, like you meant, I mean, you got the Magic, you got the Orlando City Soccer, you got MLS team, you got so much opportunities to do other things. But everyone here, there's a lot of people from all over the country. I mean, so there's a lot of different fan bases here for NFL teams, NBA teams, whatever. But it's interesting to see them, how much people have embraced in this community, UCF, and what they've been able to do. And I mean, like I said, it's funny. You'll talk to people all the time. They'll be like, I'm coming down for a game. And they'll come down like 2 days earlier and they'll send you a text and say, hey, where can I go eat at Disney, or where can I go? You know what I mean? And it's like, so I think there is an opportunity here. And I've even talked a little bit about, the idea of that. I would love to see the Big 12 host some events here. Obviously the Kia Center, which hosts the Magic. Point. They host the NCAA tournament. They've done host first round games at the NCAA tournament there. The American Athletic Conference held 2 years in a row, held its men's basketball tournament there. I know that Kansas City is kind of a traditional setup, but I've always felt like Orlando would be another great spot if they ever wanted to move it around, where people would come. You've got enough opportunities. The travelers can be there real easy with the airport, and the weather's outstanding. I mean, even in November, it's going to be warm and sunny, and the beaches are going to be full of people.
They could also do something like, I mean, I know you're not going to want to move on-campus conference games to a neutral site, but what if you took 4 Big 12 schools, and every other year, because we've been talking about this with Arizona fans, Vegas is kind of, everybody's sad that Vegas has sort of fallen off the radar. I mean, the Big 12 Media Days was there, but I mean, that's not an everyday, a permanent thing, and that's not for fans per se. But, Vegas and Orlando host 4 Big 12 teams playing 4 other teams in a 2-day showcase. So you get to come and see UCF and Arizona and Kansas and, Utah and basketball, play teams from other places that might want to come visit there and create mini, multi-team events and stuff like that utilize the conference footprint and also the locale. And I could definitely see Orlando, to me, I like Orlando better than Vegas, but that's because we live close enough. Vegas I can handle 2 days and I'm done. Orlando, I need about 2 weeks to get everything done. But
yeah, I did 3 days in Vegas and that was enough for me. So, and I come from a tourist town. So what does that tell you? So
no, I hear you. Well, Matt, thank you so much for visiting with us. Michael, do you have anything else? I don't want to cut us off if we got other questions.
No, this is great. It was great to meet Matt and hear his stories about Orlando, and it's something new and cool, I think, for Arizona fans, especially where we've been in the Pac-12 for so long, very West Coast, Mountain, Southwest region oriented, to kind of branch out a little bit. It's a cool thing and something to look forward to.
Yeah, and as our fans who are listening to this and watching this are going to notice that we haven't talked a lot about the history between Arizona and UCF in various sports, because there isn't a lot. There's a little bit here and there, but not a ton. So that's the cool part too, is new experiences, and we're going to get to see that in football this season in Orlando for the Space Game, which is going to be great. And then obviously the rest of the sports as the seasons go on. So Matt Murschel from the Orlando Sentinel, thank you for joining us. For those who are listening to this, Matt has on the video behind him, he's got up on his wall, like every good journalist who does these discussions should have, his social media accounts at OS Matt Murschel. That's OSMATTMURSCHEL on all the platforms. And you can also find his stuff at the Orlando Sentinel. Thanks for joining us. I'm Brett Farah, and for Michael Lev, we'll be back with more of the Big 12 Blitz pretty soon. Thanks.